Good afternoon. I am Tom Maccagnano, President-elect of NJPSA and the very proud principal of the Dr. Ronald E. McNair High School in Jersey City. It is my pleasure to introduce our final speaker of today's program. March is a unique time in the political world, not just in the world of basketball, with our governor giving his budget address, legislators filing petitions, and schools receiving state aid figures. Here to make sense out of the topics of budgets, education, well, hopefully sense, and politics is NJPSA's own trusted friend and guide, Dr. Ben Dworkin of the Rowan Institute of Public Policy and Citizenship. As one of New Jersey's most astute and widely quoted political analysts, he serves as a nonpartisan commentator on political developments in New Jersey and nationally. In addition to the phenomenal work he does with students at Rowan, Dr. Ben Dworkin also has appeared on numerous network and cable news shows and is frequently quoted by all of New Jersey's major newspapers and radio stations, as well as the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, USA Today, the Chicago Tribune, and the Los Angeles Times. It is my pleasure to welcome and turn our attention to Dr. Ben Dworkin.
Thank you so much, Tom. I really only, anytime somebody says those kinds of nice things, you really just hope your students were there to hear it. Like, they actually might believe you. Thank you. I appreciate it. It's an honor to be with you here all today. I hope to get through this and keep you engaged and thinking about something besides the lunch that awaits you. I know we're running behind. It's not my fault that your stomach's grumbling, just we're behind. So I appreciate your indulgence. Because our politics today is challenging. Educational politics is challenging. The issues are changing and varied and all over the map. And so as I was preparing for today and everything we might want to talk about, I was reminded of an old joke, a very old joke, about the effort to build the Holland Tunnel in the 1920s between New Jersey and New York City. And as the project started to take shape, they put out a request for bids. One bid was for $240 million, another was for $300 million, another for about $275 million, and these are 1920 dollars to build a tunnel. And then there was one bid for $100,000. Now, so the people overseeing the project were shocked, but felt obligated for the sake of due diligence to investigate, and so they went to the firm of Armstrong and Jones. And they go to their offices and they knock on the door. And Jones answered, because Armstrong was away for the day. "How can you dig this tunnel for that price?" "Simple," says Jones. "Armstrong will take a shovel, he'll go to the New York side, and he'll start digging. I will take a shovel and I'll dig from the New Jersey side." The committee is incredulous. "This is ridiculous. What if you don't even meet?" And Jones says, "So, then you'll have two tunnels." We have a lot to try to cover today, and truthfully, it's a little bit all over the place, but hopefully we'll meet in the middle. That's our goal. What I'd like to do for you in the time that I have is to assess today, where we are today, by understanding some of the lessons we've learned over the past few years, because it's those lessons that are shaping the politics of today, and particularly 2023. The lessons that we've experienced come in three areas: the legacy of the pandemic, the 2021 elections, and the 2022 elections. And then I'll suggest some ways in which those lessons shape, again, what we can expect in the education debate in New Jersey this year. So let's begin with the legacy of the pandemic. Indeed, this week marks 3 years since we shut everything down. And as I put that down on paper, I was like, that was 3 years ago? And on one hand, it seems like last week, and on the other hand, it seems like that was forever ago. There are many lessons that we can take from having survived the brunt of COVID-19, but I'd like to suggest that we focus on three of them for today. And the first lesson is this: healthcare workers and public safety professionals are not the only frontline workers. Our teachers, our principals, and supervisors are frontline critical workers and must be treated as such. When you shut down, the whole state shuts down. And not a lot of people realized that back in 2020. Emergency planners, policymakers, I don't think they truly appreciated the role you played until after they were well into it. And so all the prioritization of anybody who's working in a hospital needs to be vaccinated first. All these people need extra resources. We have to help them. And no one was understanding how an operational state, just the existence of society, relies on its children being able to be educated and moving in and out in a way so that parents can go to work. All of those things, no one addressed that. No one thought about it. No one said, well, what do we need to do to make that happen? That was a lesson we've learned. So let me say right here, thank you. Thank you for your creativity, your perseverance, your steadfast dedication to your colleagues, to your communities, to all of our kids. And that lesson is an important one, that the school personnel are frontline workers too and deserve to be treated better. Second lesson from the pandemic. We have a laptop economy. As I'm looking out at a gazillion little things and people. Now, you might be, buying something on eBay while I'm talking, but I understand. I handle this in college, too. We all understand that we live in an information age. But when the pandemic hit, it was like the waters of a flood receding, and you finally saw what was the real dividing lines on the bottom and the things that separate us as a society. And one of those major dividing lines was whether you used a laptop at work. Because if you did, or you could adapt to using one to do your work, then you most likely kept your job. And if you didn't, then you were out of work and you were out of luck. Teachers, professors, bankers, analysts, traders, we, for the most part, stayed employed. We had to work from home, but because we could do the work on a laptop, we were able to keep our jobs. If you worked at the mall, if you worked in pretty much anywhere in retail or hospitality, it was a different story. The laptop economy also has an class prism laid on top of it, because people who use their laptops to do the work tend to, not always, tend to make more money than people who don't. And since New Jersey has a rather progressive tax structure, that is, those who make more money pay more money, state revenues didn't fall the way we all sort of anticipated they were going to fall when we shut down the state 3 years ago. So when poorer New Jerseyans are laid off and wealthier New Jerseyans who use laptops to do their work stay employed, the state is still able to collect its money. And New Jersey's treasury is now flush, unlike any other time in recent history, certainly. At least the last 40 years, if you were looking at it percentage-wise. The result of a laptop economy. Third lesson from the pandemic that I'd like to highlight is this. Everybody's got an opinion on education, especially when you see it in action. And here's what I mean. My wife and I are engaged in the education of our 3 girls, but outside of an occasional email here or there, personally, I did not engage with my children's teachers outside of official events like back-to-school nights, PTA meetings, a parent-teacher conference. That happened a few times a year. But once the classroom was in my kitchen, I got to see a lot more. I got to hear a lot more. And for many parents, it was hard to ignore because everybody's got an opinion on education. So the rise in mobilized parents across the country, not just here in New Jersey, is not just a function, as Senator Gopal rightly pointed out, of groups manipulating communities, but it's also because parents were, in many cases, for the first time, looking over the shoulder of their child while they were teaching for months on end. Now, this is incredibly unfair to school personnel who are trying to adapt to how to teach on a Zoom. So you're looking at me, it's like a performer saying, don't judge me, last night was terrible, I had a sore throat, that was the wrong, I didn't want you to see that night, I wasn't at my best when you put me in front of a classroom. But here we have parents, everybody's got an opinion, and they were literally just hearing the conversation go on. That's part of what's happening here. Now, this year, as I'm sure I came in the tail end, but I'm sure they mentioned it, this year's an election year in New Jersey. All 120 seats in the state legislature are going to be up for grabs. And so the issues and debates in education in New Jersey in 2023 are also going to be shaped not just by the lessons of the pandemic, but by the lessons from the last two elections. We start with 2021, our last state election. Now, there are two schools of thought about how to understand the 2021 elections, which you might recall ended up with Phil Murphy getting reelected by a solid, though smaller than expected, margin, and Democrats losing a handful of seats in the legislature, but still retaining majorities, strong majorities, solid majorities in both houses. Now, the first school of thought, perhaps best articulated by the state Senate president, Nick Scutari, is that Democratic losses were because the party veered too far from the center, that people thought the party's leaders were not focused enough on kitchen table issues. And thus, affordability becomes the zeitgeist in Trenton, the buzzword in the capital that brings focus and direction to everyone's agenda. Affordability is like quality. Yeah, we're interested in affordability all the time. I mean, it's not new. It's always been tough to make ends meet here in New Jersey. It's an expensive state. But since we are all taxpayers, let us not begrudge the fact that they're focusing on affordability and just move on and say thank you. Now, the second school of thought that comes out of the 2021 election, which I pretty much will admit was the Dworkin school of thought, argued that the 2021 elections were about COVID and therefore really an outlier. It was the first election where New Jerseyans got to vent their anger over lockdowns, over closures, over an unemployment insurance system that the state had that simply could not handle the demand, over their children's learning loss and social stagnation, over all of it. And since the Democrats were in control of this state, the Democrats took the brunt of their voter backlash. Thank you. It wasn't enough, certainly, it wasn't enough anger to flip the state. There are a lot more Democrats in New Jersey today than there are Republicans. We're talking about 1 million more registered Democrats than registered Republicans. Now, 15 years ago, that number was 260,000. It's now grown to 1 million. It's a lot more Democrats now. So it wasn't enough to flip the state, but it was enough to knock off then State Senate President Steve Sweeney, sending shockwaves throughout the political world. And my point here is that Steve Sweeney didn't lose his seat because he became too progressive. He lost his seat because people who never show up to legislative elections were ticked off, and they showed up. They showed up in presidential elections. They voted for Donald Trump. They were people who felt that was a message that appealed to them. Did they ever show up in legislative elections before? No. And in Steve Sweeney's district, which is Gloucester, Salem counties, 12,000 of them showed up. Steve Sweeney, who won by 10,000 votes a few years before, loses by 2,000 votes. He got the same number of votes he had when he won with 60%. It's just that all these people showed up. Now, again, I like to think that I have a school of thought, and I'm a professor. It's nice people who listen to me, but that doesn't always happen. If you're Nick Scutari and you're the state Senate president, you say affordability is the lesson, then that's the lesson that we now have to deal with. And so that is where we are. A second lesson from 2021 is that the party's national brand will affect its state brand as well. In 2021, we learned that when national Democrats are perceived poorly, it rubs off on state Democrats too. And this was surprising, as Senator Dworkin, I think, was the one who mentioned it in the panel, because usually we're very much an island from Washington craziness in terms of politics. The kind of dysfunction and the lack of compromise and camaraderie and coalition building that you find in Washington, D.C. has not infected New Jersey's political system. Despite all of our faults, and there are plenty in Garden State politics, we actually get things done because we don't incentivize the demonization of the other side. We don't, not the way they do in Washington. And so if we hearken back to 2021, Democrats in Washington were at their lowest point heading into the fall when we were about to have New Jersey's elections. Recall that the Biden administration started out strong. They showed up in Washington in January of 2021 and were given generally good marks for rolling out COVID vaccines and pushing through the pandemic relief funding. Shots in your arm, checks in your pocket. But we had then, by the summer, 6 months later, the debacle of the withdrawal from Afghanistan, the scourge of inflation, which was 1.7% when Biden took office, was steadily rising. And despite unified control of the House, the Senate, and the White House, albeit with small majorities, Democrats were coming across as the gang that couldn't shoot straight. You remember back then, they couldn't pass the infrastructure bill. They couldn't pass any of the Inflation Act things that they eventually did. But back then, in September and October, heading into the 2021 election season here in New Jersey, the headlines were about Democrats yelling at each other and screaming, and this one's going back and that one, and we can't cut a deal. And so when you have New Jersey Democrats, led by Governor Murphy, arguing that they had steered the ship through the storm, they were not getting as much credit as they expected for their own competence, because Washington Democrats were looking utterly incompetent. Now, most observers believe that the drag on New Jersey Democratic candidates was at least 2 to 3 points in the polls, simply because congressional Democrats were so out of favor. And so this becomes a lesson for us in 2023. Finally, I'd like to suggest to you that there's one in particular lesson from the 2022 elections that will shape our educational politics this year. It seems like a lifetime ago, but it was actually just 5 months when many of us were stunned by the congressional races of 2022. Democrats overperformed, Republicans underperformed for a number of reasons. A 5-seat majority for the Democrats in the House becomes a 5-seat majority for the Republicans in the House. And the Senate, that had been expected to move solidly into the red column, actually became more Democratic by a single vote, moving from 50-50 to 51-49. So what's the lesson here? We remain a bitterly divided, and in fact, evenly divided country. Over the last 30 years, one of the starkest political developments has been the growth in hyper-partisanship. And you can blame your cell phones and social media, you can blame 24/7 cable news, any number of different things have developed, have contributed to this. But this growth in hyper-partisanship has hollowed out the political center. The political center where our institutions, whether they are businesses, whether they are educational systems, rely on the political center to give them stature and strength in order to do their jobs. As one of your members said, I just want to be able to do my job. You need a political center in order to do that. And what has happened in the last 30 years is that we've lost that. Think of it, I mentioned this image before in speaking to this group, so some of you might have heard it, but it's still worth mentioning again. We grew up, you took a civics class, you took AP, APUSH, or whatever it was in your school, and you taught that if you were to diagram the American electorate, it looks like a bell curve. It's this, most people are a little right of center, a little left of center, people in there, and there are folks out on the extremes. That's what the American electorate was. Think of it as a one-hump camel. And what we've become is a two-hump camel. And we have moved aside. We watch different TV, we read different papers, we follow different things. If you don't have anybody who really disagrees with you on your Facebook page, and I talk to an audience that is a little bit older, and so I understand you actually might still have Facebook pages, as opposed to my students who are like, what's that? But, you know, we tend to congregate with people who agree with us. And so if you're somebody who really doesn't like Donald Trump, you don't have a lot of like pro-Trump people on your Facebook page. You just don't. And vice versa. So we have become this two-hump camel, and that kind of division is reinforced. And not only have we separated, but those two humps are basically the same size. Think of the numbers. In 2016, a shift of 80,000 votes, and we're talking out of 170 million cast. 80,000 votes in 3 states, and we would have had President Hillary Clinton. In 2020, a shift of 45,000 votes in a race that had more Americans vote than ever before in the history of the Republic. 45,000 votes shifted in 3 states, and we would have had 4 more years of President Trump. In 2022, this trend continued. A switch of 3,500 votes across the nation in just 5 congressional districts, and you would have had Speaker Nancy Pelosi. That is how evenly we divided are. And we tend to forget that because we live in a state like New Jersey, which I just said has become much more democratic. But it is out there, and what this kind of division might not seem as hardened in a blue state like New Jersey, but it makes a difference in even the smallest communities because it becomes that much harder to find common ground. Because the people who are on the other side of whatever side you're arguing don't see where they all come together. It doesn't make sense to folks in this kind of political environment. So we have all these lessons that we've learned from the past 2 elections and from going through the pandemic, and I'd suggest to you today that we should think of them as factors, as ingredients that will shape the flavor of some of the big debates that we will be having in education this year. And one of those debates is school funding. The governor's budget proposal for fiscal year 24 marks the 6th year of a 7-year phase-in to fully funding New Jersey's school funding formula. This is hard to explain to my students, much less parents and taxpayers, but as you know, the basic idea is this. For about 100 years, we have been arguing about how to give every community an equal shot at quality education. And this happened well before the modern era of school funding formulas. Happened when we used to just have every school was its own, every building was its own school district. So one town with 5 schools would have 5 school districts. So the wealthy neighborhood had the nice school, and the poorer neighborhood had the poor school. And the moment the legislature in the 1890s said, hey, let's have everybody in one town pay for one school district, as we all understand it to be today, what those rich, wealthy neighborhoods, they said, oh, you know what? We're going to use an even more obscure law from the mid-1800s, and we're going to become our own town. Bergen County, where I'm from, 24 towns were created between 1894 and 1895. There were only 70 towns in the whole place. I mean, but that, and then they changed the law. That was one of those things. But all of this is saying that we have gone through a century of fighting about school funding. And what does thorough and efficient mean? So the School Financing Reform Act, SIFRA, is passed and signed by Governor John Corzine, and it has as its basic principle, the money follows the student. You could be the wealthiest overall neighborhood, but if you got 10 kids who are getting reduced lunch or free lunch and are qualified at that kind of thing, then you get extra money for those 10 kids. Some schools have more, some schools have, but that was the thing. And that was deemed by the court to be constitutional, if fully funded. Of course, a year or so later, and we had the Great Recession. And so now there was no money. Governor Christie made the choice to cut over $1 billion in education. And over the next few years of the Christie administration, the guide was just don't give everybody the same amount they got last year. Don't get anybody less. At least hold them harmless, keep them there. And here's the problem with that. You can't get around this. People move. They do. And so you end up with a situation where some school populations go up and some school populations go down, which under the theory of the formula was supposed to adjust the aid you got. But we're holding everybody harmless. So some schools are seeing significant drops in their populations, and in theory, at least according to the formula, they were supposed to be adjusted in terms of their aid accordingly. And some schools were getting huge increases in population, and we're getting no more money, even though they've got 200 more students or more in their districts, and some of you may be there. And so over time, that system was so far out of whack that we had to come up with this 7-year plan to try to ramp things up. And my point here is that even that as we might praise $10.75 billion in school funding for K through 12 education, an increase of $830 million, and that is a big number. there are still some schools being shortchanged, and there are some who are receiving more than they might officially receive under the formula. And more importantly, school funding brings us back to that lesson that affects it of affordability. You know, during its first term, the Murphy administration's response to anybody who was asked about, well, what are you doing about New Jersey's highest in the nation property taxes? They point to their increases in school aid. The more school aid we provide, the more we subsidize property taxes. The more we subsidize property taxes, the more affordable we make New Jersey. So as long as we're funding schools, or doing more to fund schools, it's as if we're giving you a property tax break. The second term of the Murphy administration is now expanded its property tax relief efforts through the Anchor rebate program. Now, there are lots of political reasons why you initiate this kind of tax rebate program, but it only makes sense logistically because New Jersey is flush with cash. The laptop economy lesson. We are flush because we live in that kind of economy combined with our progressive tax structure. Indeed, we are so flush right now, and that when several legislators, including Senator Gopal, in competitive districts complained about cuts in their towns, in their districts, voila, $102 million was found right away. And it got passed. It's passed the Senate already, passed the Assembly Appropriations Committee yesterday. This is moving forward. Does it fully restore the cuts? No, but something is better than nothing. Now, another major issue that's going to be part of this discussion on Education New Jersey as we move forward for the rest of this year is the labor shortage, particularly teaching labor shortage. You have all seen this, and you are not alone. With 3.3% unemployment, which we should understand is as low as it's been in the last 20 years. And it's only because I couldn't quite get the numbers for 25 years ago that I can tell you. It might have been lower than that. But this is historically low. So everybody is facing a challenge of trying to find workers. School districts are not immune. Indeed, it's harder to find workers because, as you've now been talking about, it's tough to be a teacher these days. So we might have learned the lesson that educators are frontline workers too. But we also need to accept that it takes a certain temperament and a tough skin to be on the front line these days. It's tough, in part, because some of these other lessons I cited. First, we have a very divided nation. And second, parents are being mobilized, in some cases manipulated, in a different way than in recent past. Shaping minds, giving back to the community, this was the dream of all of us. We all started as teachers. We wanted to be teachers. This is why you go into education, because you knew you could have that impact on a child. Those dreams for a younger generation are being tempered by the bitterness of our politics writ large. Now, there is a governor's task force on public school staff shortages in New Jersey. It issued a preliminary report which was really designed to emphasize the $20 million that the governor put into his proposed budget a few weeks ago that is going to try and address the teacher shortage. It's a little bit, it helps with a few different things, but we'll see. There's going to be more to that report eventually. This is a complicated issue, and it's going to get a lot more attention as we move through the year. Look, there are many of us, I'm sure most of us in this room, who want to see schools as shining cathedrals, as educators paid like Wall Street executives. And the usual excuse for not doing any of that is because we don't have the money. Except for now, this proposed budget has a $10 billion surplus. That's billion with a B. Overall, the biggest question in Trenton over the next few months right now is this: is $10 billion too much? Could we live with $9 billion? And what could you do with $1 billion? Now, everybody's got an idea on how to spend money, because like education, everyone's got an opinion on that too. But that is part of where we are right now. So are you going to put money more to the Schools Development Authority and take care of some of these century-old or older school buildings that we have in some of our urban areas? Are you going to put more money into healthcare? Are you going to put more money into New Jersey Transit? I mean, everybody's got an opinion here, but that money is available for the first time. Usually we're talking about constricting. We have to make decisions, tough decisions, because we don't have the cash. And now we do. So what do you do with it? That is the question. And this debate is weird because, like I said, we haven't had this kind of question in about 40 years in this state. It's an entirely new game. So I've mentioned school funding, teacher shortage. Final issue that I suggest we're going to be seeing is over the question over curriculum. And largely this is about sex education, but let's not kid ourselves, it does not stop there. If parents are demanding the opportunity to opt their child out of health class, then why shouldn't we expect them to demand that they get to opt out of science class? Because you're teaching evolution. Why shouldn't we expect them to opt out of history class? Because you're teaching about the legacy of slavery. There's no reason to think one is not going to lead to the other. If some books are banned and deemed offensive because they share stories of different kinds of families, then why won't other books be banned too? Because they also violate one's sense of propriety or religious belief. You know, at one point, the most popular books in this country were the Harry Potter books, just all of them, 1 through 7. And the most widely banned books in this country at the exact same time were the Harry Potter books. That is where we find ourselves. People might not see the equivalency of Harry Potter and My Two Dads, but they are in a lot of different ways. And so we need to be very cautious as we head into this debate. Next week, the House of Representatives will be putting up a parental Bill of Rights for a vote. It will pass. It's not going to become law, but it will give legitimacy and normalcy to the ideas behind that bill. And that will strengthen those voices around the state in your districts that will challenge the educational content of your school curricula. This is how the National Party brand, that lesson about how Washington can shape what's happening here, the National Party brand is going to affect New Jersey politics. Over the coming year, it's going to be harder and harder to dismiss these curriculum challenges to our educational system. In many cases, those complaining are woefully misinformed, and in many cases, innocent parents are being deliberately misled. But that doesn't mean that any of us in any community where these attacks emerge will be able to easily cast them aside. In many ways, what we're going to need right now is a new public education effort. How fortunate we are in that very business. That's what we do. We have to, but now it's not just your students you're gonna have to educate, you've got to educate your parents. And you've got to educate everybody about what is and what is not going on. Because if Vin Gopal is the only one who can sit here and say confidently, this, you cannot point to any place this is happening, and somebody who heard something or found something is saying it, you've got to be able to say that too. You've got to tell your friends and your communities so they understand it as well. What I tried to do today is to offer for your consideration several lessons that are shaping education politics today. From the legacy of the pandemic, we have 3 lessons. Schools and those who make them run are frontline workers. The laptop economy has allowed New Jersey to emerge flush with cash, and parents got a front row seat to their children's education during the shutdown, and therefore they have opinions. From the 2021 elections, we have 2 lessons. Affordability is what people care about. National party politics shapes how people think about state politics. And from the 2022 election, we have the lesson that we are a divided country, with each side being about the same size, relatively speaking, as the other side across the nation. All of these lessons are going to shape education politics this year as we debate school funding, as we debate a shortage of educators, and we debate the vocal minority of parents who have concerns about educational content. To be sure, it is a challenging time, but I'd suggest to you it is your time. You are the leaders. And this conference will surely make you better ones, and you will help us move forward. I'd like to end just with something my late father used to share with me. Benny would say, always remember this, in the vast history of the world, no one has ever washed a rented car. And I was about 9 when he told me this. I was like, what? No one has ever washed a rented car. This is a lesson we can really remember, because you can't rent democracy or the system of public education that makes it work. It's not something you borrow and return. To make democracy work, every citizen, those in this room and our constituencies of parents and citizens in our towns who support our budgets, everyone has to take ownership, even if you don't have kids in the schools. Everyone has to take ownership in our schools, in our communities, in our state, in our nation. You can't rent this. When we connect with all of the additional owners of democracy, we will then have the team that will take our state and your schools and our children forward. Thank you, and I'd be glad to answer any questions. We're running late, everyone's hungry, so it's up to you guys whether you want to do it. But I'm happy to answer a question if anybody's got, if they allow it.
Go ahead.
Did you say $10 billion?
10 billion, yes. Now, we should just understand, look, in 2008, 2009, when the Great Recession hit, on a $30 billion budget, we lost, just the revenue dropped out of the bottom there, and we lost about $6 billion in expected revenue. So that's about 20%. We're at a $50 billion budget. So 20% is about 10%, and that'll be the justification by a lot of people who defend this. We're at a much bigger budget. We want to have about a 20%. But I've been involved with budgets where we had 400 million surplus. I mean, we just didn't have the money to do it. So there's an argument that be made for 10 billion, but there are plenty of arguments that, like, you know what, we can be fine with 8, and all of this is a hedge. I mean, you have a surplus in case there's some kind of massive recession in the next 12 months or next 18 months, because we're sort of start in July. Maybe, maybe not, but that's where we are. It's 10 billion. Yeah.
So what do you think about the CBT surtax being sunset?
The question is about the corporate business tax, which was supposed to be temporary, which literally has the word temporary in its name. It's a tax surcharge on corporations. The governor wants to see it go. The legislative majorities are not so sure that they want to see it go. When you have a budget that the governor proposes and the legislature disposes. So there's a little dance that is going on here, and everybody's trying to, like, well, what are you going to give me if I let you get that? And we'll see how it all plays out. I think if the governor really wants it, then the governor can do it.
Represents about $1 billion a year.
Yeah, I forget exactly how much it's generating.
He says $1 billion.
But the point is that he can, in his budget, he's proposed to eliminate it, and therefore we still have $10 billion. I mean, that's just to show you how nobody expected. When we were in the throes of the pandemic, they were borrowing money they weren't sure you were going to get money from the feds, from the Trump administration back in the day. It wasn't clear that it was all going to start flowing, and everybody was making certain decisions that now have effects for us today, and also gives us options today. There you go. Any number of things can be done with that kind of money. Everybody's hungry. I get it. Okay. Thank you, folks. Appreciate it.